Robert Chen adjusted his worn-out blue sweater, the one his late wife Margaret had gifted him years ago, as he stepped into the gleaming showroom of Luxury Motors. His shoes clicked softly against the polished marble floor, a stark contrast to the faded Toyota Corolla he'd parked outside, a car he'd driven for over 20 years. At 72, Robert carried himself with quiet dignity, his silver hair neatly combed and his weathered leather wallet clutched tightly in his hand. The showroom was a world of opulence. Gleaming cars stood like silent sentinels, their polished surfaces reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. Robert's eyes were drawn to a silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class, its sleek design exuding luxury and power. It was his dream car, the one he'd spent 2 years saving for, though $120,000 in his savings account represented countless sacrifices, delayed vacations, skipped dinners, and careful budgeting. As he approached the car, a young salesman in an expensive suit sauntered over. His name tag read Blake, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Robert pointed to the S-Class. "Yes, I'm interested in this one." Blake's lips curled into a smirk as he exchanged glances with another salesman nearby. "Sir, this is the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. It starts at $110,000. Perhaps I can show you something more suitable. We have some nice used Toyotas." Robert's cheeks burned, but he held his ground. "I'm aware of the price. I'd like to test drive it, please." Blake chuckled, his voice laced with mockery. "Listen, sir, we don't do test drives without proof of funds. We can't risk wasting time with window shoppers." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his worn leather wallet, pulling out a neatly folded bank statement. "I have the money," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing knot of humiliation in his chest. He extended the paper toward Blake, hoping this would end the dismissive treatment. Blake barely glanced at the statement before snickering. "Sir, this is a luxury car dealership. We serve a certain caliber of clientele." His tone was loud enough to draw the attention of other employees, who began to gather, poorly concealing their amusement. The sales manager, Derek Thompson, strode over with a smirk plastered across his face. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd already decided Robert was the problem. Robert straightened his posture, clutching the crumpled bank statement in his fist. "I'd like to test drive the S-Class. I have the funds." Thompson crossed his arms, his voice booming across the showroom. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're making our actual customers uncomfortable." The words hung in the air like a slap, and the snickers from the staff echoed in Robert's ears. For a moment, Robert stood frozen, his eyes burning with unshed tears. He thought of Margaret, how she would have squeezed his hand and told him to hold his head high. "Very well," he said softly, turning to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back. "You know, my wife always said that character reveals itself in how you treat those you think can't benefit you." The showroom fell silent as Robert walked out, the crumpled bank statement still clenched in his hand. The sting of humiliation lingered, but beneath it, a spark of determination began to grow. That evening, Robert sat in his study, surrounded by framed photographs of Margaret and their life together. The room was filled with memories, her favorite books, the quilt she'd knitted, and the scent of her perfume that still lingered faintly in the air. Instead of his usual evening tea, Robert was on the phone with his son, Michael, a successful investment banker in New York. "They did what?" Michael's voice crackled with anger over the speaker. "Dad, that's unacceptable. You don't deserve to be treated like that." Robert sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "It's fine, son. I'll just try another dealership tomorrow." "No, Dad, it's not fine," Michael insisted, his tone firm. "You've worked too hard to be disrespected like that. Let me look into this." There was a pause, followed by the sound of rapid typing on a keyboard. "Did you know Luxury Motors is struggling?" Michael asked, his voice taking on an excited edge. "Their parent company, Automax Corp., is trying to sell the dealership for $5 million. That's actually undervalued considering their inventory and real estate." Robert sat up straighter, his interest piqued. "What are you saying, Michael?" "I'm saying we could buy it," Michael replied, his voice filled with determination. "Remember that tech company stock you invested in 20 years ago? The one I advised you to buy?" Robert nodded, though his son couldn't see him. "Those shares, worth $50,000 at the time, had grown exponentially. Yes, I remember. Well, Dad, those shares are now worth over $8 million, Michael said, his voice brimming with excitement. We can use that to buy luxury motors and turn it into something better. Robert's heart raced as the idea took root. You mean? Yes, Dad, Michael interrupted. Let's make some calls tonight. We can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow. Robert sat in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. Buying luxury motors wasn't just about revenge. It was about creating a legacy of respect and kindness. He thought of Margaret, how proud she would have been of this bold move. All right, son, Robert said, his voice steady with resolve. Let's do it. Michael wasted no time. Within hours, he had contacted Automax Corp and initiated the process of acquiring luxury motors. The parent company, eager to offload the struggling dealership, was more than willing to negotiate. By midnight, the preliminary paperwork was drafted, and the deal was set to be finalized the next morning. Robert spent the night preparing for his return to the dealership. He polished his best suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and styled his silver hair neatly. He packed his old briefcase with the ownership transfer documents, his hands trembling with a mix of nerves and excitement. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, Robert stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie. "This is for you, Margaret," he whispered, a small smile playing on his lips. "And for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." The next morning, Robert walked into Luxury Motors with a newfound confidence. His steps echoed with purpose as he entered the showroom, his briefcase clutched firmly in his hand. Blake was the first to notice him, his face twisting into a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Sir, I thought we made it clear yesterday," Blake began, his tone dismissive. Robert interrupted him politely but firmly. "Good morning. I'm here to see Derek Thompson." Blake hesitated, his smirk faltering. "He doesn't have time for—" "I think he'll make time," Robert said, his voice calm but commanding. "Tell him Robert Chen is here, the new owner of Luxury Motors." Blake's face went pale, and the other employees stopped what they were doing, whispers spreading across the showroom floor. Thompson burst out of his office, his face a mask of disbelief. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded. Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "These are the ownership transfer documents signed this morning. Automax Corp was quite happy to accept my offer." The showroom fell silent as Robert's words hung in the air. Derek Thompson's face turned ashen, his earlier arrogance replaced by stunned disbelief. Blake stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, as the other employees exchanged nervous glances. Robert stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "As my first act as owner, I'm afraid I'll have to make some personnel changes." He turned to address the gathered staff, his gaze steady. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Blake, and anyone else who participated in yesterday's entertainment, you have until the end of the day to clear out your desks." Blake stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Sir, please, I have a family." "So do many of the people you've likely humiliated over the years," Robert replied, his tone unwavering. "I suggest you remember that in your next position. Sometimes the person you look down on today might be signing your paycheck tomorrow." Thompson's face flushed with anger, but he knew there was no arguing. He stormed off to his office, slamming the door behind him. Blake, visibly shaken, began gathering his belongings, his earlier smugness replaced by humiliation. Robert turned to the remaining staff, his expression softening. "For those staying, we're going to make some changes. Every customer who walks through that door will be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or assumed wealth. We'll be implementing new training, programs, and a mystery shopper system to ensure this happens." The employees nodded, some with relief, others with newfound determination. Robert walked over to the silver S-Class he'd admired the day before and ran a hand along its sleek surface. "And this," he said with a smile, "will be my first purchase as owner. I trust that won't be a problem." Later that afternoon, Robert sat behind the wheel of his new Mercedes-Benz S-Class, breathing in the scent of leather and success. He placed Margaret's photo on the dashboard, her smiling face a reminder of the strength she'd always given him. "You were right, my love," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "Character does reveal itself, and sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways." As he drove out of the dealership, Robert felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about owning a luxury car or a dealership. It was about creating a place where kindness and respect were valued above all else. Over the next few weeks, Robert implemented sweeping changes at Luxury Motors. He introduced training programs focused on empathy and customer service, ensuring that every employee understood the importance of treating people with dignity. He also established a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth interested in automotive careers, a tribute to Margaret's belief in giving back to the community. Word of the dealership's transformation spread quickly. Customers who had once avoided Luxury Motors due to its reputation for poor service began returning, drawn by stories of exceptional treatment. Sales increased and the dealership's profits soared, proving that kindness and respect were not just morally right, but also good for business. One day, an elderly woman in shabby clothes walked into the dealership. The new sales team welcomed her warmly, taking the time to show her every car she was interested in. She turned out to be a wealthy widow looking to buy 3 cars for her grandchildren's college graduations. As Robert watched the sale unfold from his office, he smiled, thinking of how different things were now. His phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Proud of you, Dad. Mom would be too." Robert looked at Margaret's photo on his desk, her wise words echoing in his mind. The dealership's success was sweet, but the real victory was in changing its culture. Every time he saw a customer leave with a smile, regardless of whether they made a purchase, he knew he'd turned a moment of humiliation into something meaningful. A year after Robert took over Luxury Motors, the dealership had become a local legend. Its reputation for exceptional customer service and community involvement attracted customers from far and wide. Robert's scholarship fund had already helped several students pursue their dreams, and his senior assistance program had made car buying a stress-free experience for countless elderly customers. One evening, as Robert drove home in his S-Class, he noticed his neighbor struggling with grocery bags. He quickly parked and went to help her, remembering how a simple act of kindness could change someone's entire day. "Thank you, Robert," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I saw you drive up in that beautiful car. You know, I've been thinking of getting a new one myself, but I was nervous about going to a dealership at my age." Robert smiled warmly. "I know just the place, and I promise you'll be treated like family." The story of Luxury Motors spread throughout the community, becoming a symbol of hope and transformation. For Robert, the greatest reward wasn't the profitable business or even the satisfaction of proving his critics wrong. It was knowing that he'd created a place where everyone, regardless of their appearance or background, would be treated with the dignity they deserved. Every morning before the dealership opened, Robert would walk through the showroom, straightening the already perfect displays and making sure Margaret's framed quote hung prominently near the entrance. Character reveals itself in how you treat those you think can't benefit you. And sometimes when a customer would ask about the quote, Robert would smile and say, "That's quite a story. Let me tell you about it while we look at some cars."